The battle for the U.S. Senate is on, and one of the biggest races in the country is in the state of Maine. Maine is a critical state for Republicans to hold. Incumbent Susan Collins will face a Democratic challenger, Troy Jackson. In 2020, Susan Collins pulled off a stunning reelection victory. Will she be able to do it again this time? That's what we're going to be talking about in today's discussion points. I'm Myra Miller, and I'm joined today by David Winston. So, David, what's the secret to Susan Collins' success?
Well, if you look back at that 2020 race, there were two big things that occurred in that race that were just remarkable. The first one was she won 18% of the Biden vote. That was the best performance by any Senate candidate across the country by far. The other thing, too, there was a challenge within that state. Donald Trump was losing that state by 9, and part of that was because his job approval within the state was 41 to 58.
Mhm.
And what Susan Collins was able to do was win 23% of those people who disapproved of Trump. That was also just a remarkable performance. So in those two items, she was able to build a majority coalition amongst people that typically would have been difficult. Again, the Biden voters and those people who had disapproved of the job Trump was doing as president.
Mhm. Well, you're mentioning presidential job approval as a factor in that race. Well, that's a predominant factor for all Republican Senate candidates this time, not just in Maine, but everywhere else. Polling averages show President Trump's job approval around 40%. That is a difficult headwind for any incumbent from the president's party. And a big reason why his job approval is difficult is because of the state of the economy and that people just are not feeling significant relief in cost of living. Now, back in the 2024 election, Republicans were elected to fix the Biden economy and to address these economic concerns, but we're just not seeing signs that voters are feeling much relief.
And to your point, what happened in 2024 wasn't just simply, can you improve the economy?
Mhm.
It was really to fix the Biden economy, which was because prices went up over 21% during Biden's tenure. And that's what people wanted to address. And that's a little bit more challenging than just simply trying to improve things.
Right.
But Myra, but from that, that's looking at the Republican side. But what about what's the challenge on the Democratic side? What's the big challenge they're facing?
Mhm. Well, Democrats are giddy with excitement that they could see a blue wave landslide for Democrats this fall, but there are headwinds for them too. One of the biggest obstacles to that is the negative brand image of Democrats. And we found in our latest survey that the brand image, the favorable, unfavorable for congressional Democrats is 38 to 56. So they have a negative image. And then among independents, it was 30 to 62. So that critical group, independents, by 2 to 1, Democrats have a negative image. That's nationally. Now, on the other hand, the brand image of Republicans is not good either. It was 37 to 58. So both parties are going into this November's election with a very negative brand image. Among independents, which are the critical group for both parties, 42% of that group has an unfavorable view of both. So that means both Republicans and Democrats will be competing for this critical voter group where a large portion of them don't like either one. Now, in terms of what the polls are showing in Maine, many polls have shown Susan Collins behind until this past week. The Democratic candidate had been Graham Platner. Platner had been scandal plagued. There were allegations against him. And the situation finally got so problematic that he had to drop out. Democrats replaced Platner with their new candidate this last weekend, Troy Jackson. So Jackson has about 100 days to make this run against Susan Collins. Can he be successful? Up until this point, the polls had shown Collins behind. But given what we saw in 2020 with the polls, they had shown Collins behind there too, and she managed to pull off a win of 9 points. Still not clear why those polls were wrong, but Republicans seem to be taking the current polls with a grain of salt because of that.
In fact, Real Clear Politics has got that listing, and you'll find there were 14 surveys conducted during that campaign back in 2020, and
Mhm.
she didn't lead in a single one. She was behind in all of them. The most recent survey had Jackson up by 3, which is about the same margin as Plattner had. So there's not any real sense in terms of, because he's, to your point, he just got into the race.
Mhm.
And so he really hasn't been developed as a candidate and the dynamics between the two of them. But again, going back to your point, 14 surveys done in that state, public surveys, and didn't lead a single one. And yet she won by 9 points.
Let's look at her 2020 race against her Democratic opponent, Sarah Gideon. President Trump was on the ballot against President Biden. Biden won by 9, and Susan Collins won by 9 in the state of Maine. So how did she do that? I think you've got a chart for us.
So one of the big elements in terms of thinking through those two numbers that I started you off with, the winning 18% of the Biden vote that Collins did in 2020 and winning 23% of those who disapproved of the job Trump was doing as president. Well, exactly how did that come together? And what you're looking at is three key voter groups that drove that. And what you're looking at is independents who made up 41% of the electorate, moderates who made up 43% of the electorate, and women who made up 59. And what you see here is just a dramatic difference between the two. So starting with independents, Collins beat Gideon, who was her opponent back in 2020 by 3, while Trump lost to Biden by 24. Moving on to moderates, Collins beat Gideon by 7, and Trump lost to Biden amongst moderates by 24. And Myra, you were particularly focused on the number for women here, in large
Yes.
because 59% of the electorate were women.
All right. Well, before I jump into the women's number, I do want to point something out about that is independence and just what a stunning margin that is for her. That in 2020, in the state of Maine, the independents were the largest group by in terms of party ID. That independents represented 41% of the electorate, outnumbering Republicans at 31% and Democrats at 28%. So even back then, independents were the largest group, and we have seen this trend nationally and in many of these competitive states where independents are on the rise in size and influence. So this is something that people need to be watching for this fall in Maine and in other states as well. But going to the women's number, as you said, that 59%, according to the exit polls, 59% of the Maine electorate were women. That compares to 52% nationally that year. So it is an even higher number of women in the Maine electorate than was nationally. And she won. Susan Collins won women by 3, in contrast to President Trump, who lost them by 23. So a stunning gap there. This makes me think about why the allegations around Graham Platner became so problematic and why he had to step down with a state like Maine having such a high percentage of women, 59% of the electorate in 2020, that as these allegations about women against Platner were coming out, that just became much more problematic. And for several weeks leading up to his dropping out, that there were other Democrats who were trying to rationalize or to downplay those allegations. Democrats have for several years tried to talk about, they want to believe all women, the position they took against Brett Kavanaugh. But then when it was one of their own and there were allegations coming out like this, it just became so problematic. So the fact that Maine has such a high proportion of female voters meant that the problems with Platner just could not be overcome with him, and they had to replace him with Troy Jackson. So let's look at a little bit about Troy Jackson and who he is and his background, because given Collins' ability to have crossover appeal, that's going to be a challenge for him too. So he has been selected by the Democratic Party. He has positioned as a progressive. He has said he's going to bring the same type of progressive energy to the ticket that Graham Platner did. He has supported Bernie Sanders and has had Sanders support in return. He supported policies like Medicare for all, so clearly establishing himself as a progressive. On the other hand, his background, he has been able to show some crossover appeal in past elections, and he's even espoused some anti-abortion positions in his past as a Catholic. So he's got elements of being a progressive and then trying to position as a moderate as well, who can try to bring in these crossover groups, trying to have it both ways a bit. So we'll see if he can do that this November successfully.
One other thing that's interesting about him too, when you think about the Democratic primary process again, he had run in the Democratic primary for governor and finished third. So in the end, they ended up swapping out Platner, who actually won 73% of the vote in the primary,
Mhm.
ended up swapping Platner out for a guy, in this case, Jackson, who finished third in the gubernatorial primary. So obviously, there's a difficult starting point for him in terms of how does he
Mhm.
get the support of the rest of the Democratic Party. However, there's one other key item that's a positive for Collins, and that is in 2020 when she won by 9, Joe Biden was winning by 9. Kamala Harris in 2024 only won by 7. So you're potentially looking at an environment that, at least based on that, is a little bit more positive than what you had in 2020 when she pulled off putting together in very difficult circumstances a majority coalition.
Democrats seem to be hoping to leverage anti-Trump sentiment in state to propel Jackson. And maybe it's not as much about him personally as it is leveraging this anti-Trump sentiment that exists. Is that going to be enough to unseat Susan Collins? But what she has clearly demonstrated is that she has a strong record of crossover appeal, and it's not clear if Jackson will be able to do that as well. So to wrap it up, the secret to Susan Collins' success is her ability to have crossover vote and not just her own party. So for Troy Jackson, will he be able to sustain momentum among his progressive base, but also have crossover appeal to those critical groups like independents, moderate, and women? So lots still very much in play. So we'll leave it this week. Thanks everyone for joining us. Be sure to check out our website at winstongroup.net for more resources. Also, be sure to check out our recent episode on Mamdani Mania. We'll be back next week. Stay tuned for more discussion points.